on many of these active shooter events that we respond to, we know hundreds of resources are coming from multiple directions, and sometimes communications will fail, but not necessarily because the radio system fails, but because of other issues. We're going to talk about that next. Stay tuned. Welcome to the National Center for Integrated Emergency Response, NCIER. I'm Adam Pendley. I'll be your podcast host today. That was easy to say. Right, there you go. So with that, I am joined by my fire and law enforcement reverse that. My fire and law enforcement brother and sister here, Bruce Scott from the Fire Service. Welcome. Thank you for
letting me be here, Adam.
Absolutely. And Kami Mertz from the law enforcement side. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And let's get this conversation started. We were talking about this idea that the communications issues you're going to have on a very active scene when you have multiple resources. So let's talk about one of the technical issues first. So we know that our two-way radios in many of our systems are all connected to repeater systems. Most of us are on trunked 800 megahertz systems or whatnot. And we know that those types of radios have challenges in certain areas, like maybe when you enter into a school or into a hospital or something along those lines. What are some ways to kind of work around maybe some radio transmission issues to keep the mission on track? Kami, we'll start with you.
So one of the main things is depending on what you're dealing with. If you have a complete failure, a complete outage, and you're going to want to start considering things like runners, something like that. So it also might just be that it's being overloaded. You might have, bad radio discipline that is keeping you into or pushing you in towards radio failure. So you might want to, depending on the technology failure that's going on, obviously get your technology person over there, start looking at what's going on with your radio technician. But also you have to keep going with the mission. So the main thing is to keep up with something. So get a runner, somebody to come in and help. Absolutely.
Bruce, what are some strategies the fire service uses? I know personnel accountability is really important when you send crews inside. What are some other tricks?
Well, I can tell you, in my jurisdiction where I rode on a fire engine, I knew where my radios were going to be difficult, right? Mm-hmm. So I say this often, the time to figure out the solution is not when the problem's occurring, right? So if I know in this school or this building, multi-hospitals, nursing homes are also really bad, right? Mm-hmm. We knew we had to come up with a different solution. Right. Sometimes that was the person that stayed on the engine company, we flipped to a simplex frequency, which is radio to radio. That way we didn't have to hit the trunk system. The real answer to your question, Adam, is we need to know where our problems occur and plan for them accordingly before you need to figure it out.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you talked about your technology people. I think when you're making a radio plan in advance of an incident, while you've come to a new location, it's not the time to try to figure all that out. But get that person in a room when you're talking about a training or exercise or even a policy and say, what are these radios capable of? What are some of the solutions?
Yes.
And I know that in some jurisdictions, they've even made it a part of the building code that certain buildings have to have repeaters built into them for this reason. So there may even be a legislative solution in your area to kind of address these areas. But like the simplex channel, and I know many law enforcement know that they might have that type of simplex radio to radio communication because they go to it to talk about where we're going to go for dinner or something, so they've used it before, right? They just have to realize that might be a tool in the toolbox for some of these locations. And then you mentioned runners, and I think if you know that you're going to have to use that as a sneaker net, as some people have called it, running back and forth, you might have to plus up your teams to make sure that you have that. And I really want to extend on something you said, Kami, about the idea of knowing what your mission is. So, in some other conversations we've had in other podcasts and whatnot, we talk about the importance of having a team leader, or the importance of understanding your task and purpose when you leave staging, and that, you might have to go in and carry out that task and purpose and then come back out and report your progress and then get sent in with another mission. So there are other ways to work around radio difficulties. Technology, either using a simplex frequency, figuring out what other alternative repeaters you have, using runners, and that sort of thing.
Cell phones, maybe.
Cell phones. Yeah. And that's a good segue to the next thing I was going to talk about. We hear all the time that obviously many, many civilians in the area have been impacted by this event. So we hear about cell phones even being overloaded, right? So, and I know there's some cell phone sign up services now for first responders that you can get on FirstNet and some things along those lines. And again, if that's something that you haven't done yet and you're working in the field, that's probably a really good thing to think about. Or if your agency is using issued phones that are all part of FirstNet, that's something to think about. But understanding that if your plan calls for, cell phones to be used, either for apps for helping to track responders where they're inside or sending text messages or phone calls, you might need to understand that those things might have some challenges.
Right. And it's also shouldn't be your go-to. Right. We often think about, we're all very familiar with texting and making phone calls, but it shouldn't be your first solution is what I'm saying. And the only reason is because the only people that know that message is the sender and receiver. Right. And a lot of times that information sharing over your radio gets to a lot more people as opposed to a telephone call or text.
And it does seem that when you're having those radio failures, the same place you're having those radio failures, you're likely going to have cell phone failures.
No, that's true.
We have an area near where we live, and we actually did a scenario last year, I think it was, and all of it went down. The radios went down, cell phones weren't working, and it was in an actually populated that nobody would have thought that it would have not worked in, not functioned in, and it did. And so what it did was up our training, right? So then we realized if we're in this really populated area, we're not going to be able to have radio and cell phone communications, and we were on FirstNet, so even that was a failure. Nothing against FirstNet, but it just happened to be that area for some reason it has those type of technology issues, and it created a lot of, but it also helped our training because we prepared for it.
Absolutely, and then you add some follow-on actions to make sure you kind of go back and get with the companies. I mean, again, it's all about an integrated response, and I feel like every time we get together, Bruce, I steal something else from you, but you've said before that these things are not a police problem, a fire problem. They're
community problem.
They're a community problem, right? So that means we need to get their help to figure out some of these technology issues. But I also want to come back to something you said, Bruce, and I'm glad you said it because I remember this coming up a lot. Is that we, especially today, when people are so used to texting everything, you're really hampering the response by not putting things out on the radio.
Correct.
I mean, and I know some of it's either your old school thinking that, hey, people are going to be able to tap into the radios, which is not true. Most of the time they're encrypted and it's just between us, or that you're just not used to it because you're so used to texting.
Right.
And important information is delayed because only two people are hearing it.
Right.
Yeah. And then the dispatcher, not including them in this loop of information.
That's a great point.
Is I think so important. And we were talking before we started the recording. Is that dispatchers can be really effective in. You can call somebody. I can say, Cami from Adam, Cami from Adam, Cami from Adam. But then as soon as I say, dispatch, can you try to raise Cami? That voice, that dispatcher's voice cuts through everything and you hear it, right? So
we've been programmed to listen for it. So that's the voice we're hearing all day long, call to us our assignments. And so it is very beneficial. And they also have tones, which is very nice, right? To be able to alert somebody. And
high-low tone on the fire department back in the day was shut up. There's got something important to say.
Right. Yeah. And keeping them in the loop as well because that CAD system, they're keeping a fantastic record of all the things that are happening on the scene that can help us in real time. Our intel people can go to dispatch and get good information, but then, it's obviously becomes more of a permanent record of what's happening as well. So all of that I think is really important.
And it's also important.
I was just going to say the dispatcher might have critical information that needs to get to those people, those folks in the field. Yeah. So I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. And then the other portion is to consider is that if you do have those radio and cell phone failures, if you have multiple jurisdictions that are there, now you have issues with that because initially you might be able to patch them into your radio system, but if those are down, you might have to consider having a representative from each one of those jurisdictions to come to your command post or come to your tactical location to be able to make sure that there is a way to message out those responders who are on the scene, which creates a whole nother issue.
Absolutely. So it's when you think about radio communication and we talk about having a team leader and all this discipline stuff we're supposed to do, it leads to this idea that if everyone were disciplined on the radio in an information sharing sort of way, we could all be on one channel. If everybody's really disciplined about but the reality is there's a lot of stuff happening. We end up at a minimum, we have two radio channels oftentimes, the law enforcement and the fire and potentially a third radio channel for EMS services, right? So And then there are times when there's this tendency to want to put something else on another frequency. And in a technology sort of way, what are some advantages and disadvantages of using multiple frequencies, you think?
Well, I'll start. I think that it depends, right? It was just my standard answer for everything, right? You got to solve that problem at the time. But a separate channel can help you minimize the conversations on your important tactical channels, right? Your rescue task forces and your contact teams, right? You can move perimeter to another channel. You can move EMS to another channel. The problem with that is now everybody that has any sort of leadership role needs to have multiple radio channels. And to Kami's point, the ability to monitor those.
Right.
You know, I always talk about staging. If you're sending people somewhere from staging, you need to know where they're going.
Right.
And the way to know where they're going is to be monitoring that channel. The call for that resource will come on that particular channel. So it's just a little bit more of a burden on your staging managers, if you will. Positives are, it helps minimize conversations. Or the negative is you have a lot more radio channels to monitor.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it really does. It keeps, and that's the whole thing, though, is especially with radio discipline anyways, right? Radio discipline is so important, and we preach radio discipline, but we all know the one person who gets on the radio and speaks for a good 30, 45 minutes, and you can't get them to stop, right?
Right.
And so that does help with when you switch those multiple different entities off into their own radio channel. Sometimes that can help eliminate some of that unnecessary radio chatter from those important channels.
We used to make fun of some of our officers on the fire department years ago. We thought maybe they could talk the fire out, right? the more that they talked on the radio, the faster the fire will go out.
Yeah. That's true. So you know, we know that your technology needs potential backup systems. You need to know that you may even have to fail back to just face-to-face communication. We know that good radio discipline helps using your position title as your radio call sign instead of your individual number.
That's a huge one, yeah.
We know these are all tools in the toolbox to help use the technology to its best ability. But Bruce, I know you read a lot of after action reports, and Kami, I know you do as well. When the number one thing that shows up in all of them is what?
Communication. 100%.
And it's always talking about the radio's failed, right?
No. Oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes it's that we're not talking to each other, whether it's whatever method you use. To your point, you read after action reports, you'll see commonalities in all of them. And one of them is communications. And people immediately gravitate towards my radio doesn't talk to your radio. Well, the truth of the matter is most of our communication failures could be fixed by integration, standing next to each other and having conversations and work together as a team.
Yep.
And knowing what's important to say to each other, right? I mean, like actually communicating. And we say this a lot when we're teaching, we're doing exercises, is that there's a communications loop that has to be closed, right? You have to have clear communication with confirmation, so that you're not just speaking into the dark, that if you have something important to say, make sure it's going to the right person and making sure that they receive it.
And I think that's the most important thing is the acknowledgement. You have to have them acknowledge on the other side, just like you would any other messages. You want to make sure that they understand the plan and their role in the plan. And so if you're just randomly throwing things on the radio and you're not getting back that acknowledgement, you're going to have that communication failure.
Right. And another thing we often see is you start your message, and then I'll jump in with another message because whatever I'm getting ready to say is obviously more important than what you're saying. So you never get that loop closed, right? And you talk about radio discipline. It's understanding that there is a message going back and forth here that needs to be acknowledged before I jump in.
Absolutely.
Because you could potentially get somebody killed, right? Because you're not getting that critical information, or you know, whatever you want to say is obviously more important. So discipline is important.
Well, it especially includes if you are on more than one channel. You know, this seems like simple advice, but we need to be reminded of it. That if you go to a new channel, take a pause to make sure there's not that ongoing communication first before you just jump right in there. So, you know, I heard somebody say one time, and I think it's in some of our written material, that that good information can be sticky. And I didn't know what that meant at first, and then I really thought about it. And what it means is you have it, and you don't really know who to give it to or how to get rid of that information. And I think that's a big communication peril that we find ourselves in sometimes. So how do you discern important information from stuff that's just part of the background noise, if that makes sense?
Well, I think it's deciding if that intel is going to be something that that's actionable intel, right? That somebody can use, that is going to change the course of our mission, that's going to change the course of our decision making.
Right.
And so you're going to get a lot of information. You're going to get a lot of double information. And that's really where that intel piece comes through, that intel piece is going to work through that information and decide what is the critical information and who does it need to go to through that command. So that command can look at that information and say, that needs to get to this person immediately. And you're having those discussions of who needs to know that. But I think that's really going to come to your intel portion of things.
Yeah. So, Bruce, if you're on the fire ground and the balcony in the back of the building suddenly collapses to the ground, I don't have that much fire ground experience, but how do you keep multiple people from calling that same piece of information in? I mean, what's the discipline there?
Yeah, and be honest with you, it depends. Again, my standard answer. The truth of the matter is, as long as the message gets sent. What about the engine company or ladder company that's under that balcony?
Right.
They have important information to get out too. I have personal experience with this, calling a mayday.
Right.
If you hear a mayday over the fire channel, everybody shuts up, right? And if they have to change channels, everybody else goes to a different channel, and the company that called that mayday stays on the channel they were on. Everything else goes to another channel. But you talk about sending and receiving critical information. The one time I had to call a mayday, nobody heard me but our communication center.
Right.
And we're able to just hit that high-low tone and go, hey, hey, boss, this engine company's in trouble, right? And get us some help. So,
and again, that's why it's so important to solve those challenges. And if you go back to the technology issue, the reality is you want to make these places that you have communication problems, either from training exercise or real world incidents, get that fixed, because being able to have everyone be able to hear those transmissions is really important. And then, of course, your simplex channels is a solution, but it's not. It should be temporary. And of course, face to face is another problem. But
Well, and with that too is when you're talking about the different is to get people patched in early. As I do see that it's really common in a lot of incidents where we have multiple jurisdictions coming, say FHP, something like that, that's also joining. There's a delay in that patch. We're waiting for it to work itself out before we do that patch, and that time delay is really critical in communication failures.
Right. It's funny that you mentioned the state police, because I remember it wasn't an incident, thank goodness. It was an exercise we were involved in, but reminding everyone again to use plain language, because even within our area, we were going through the scenario, and the state police officer was saying that they had a signal 30 and the two more signal 30s in the kitchen. And I said, well, wait a minute, what does that mean? He said, well, those are gunshot wounds. And I said, well, for us, signal 30 means abduction.
Abduction, yeah.
So and again, if you call that out, you're really sending things in a whole left field direction.
Or confusing everybody, right? Because everybody's wondering how that happened.
Exactly.
And it's hard to go to plain talk if day to day use 10 codes and signals.
Right.
The moment you go under stress, trying to remember to use plain talk is something we got to be trained. It's got to be trained out of us.
Right. Yes. And one of the recommendations that I would make under those circumstances is your day-to-day policy should be that, using a lot of police agencies especially still use a lot of signals and 10 codes. But the moment you get moved to a tactical channel, it should be automatic that you then switch to plain language. And if you did that in every day-to-day incident, the more critical incidents I think would come a little more naturally.
That's a good idea.
Yes.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
So again, there's fixes. You either figure out if it's a technology problem, if it's an actual how do we talk to each other problem, or if it might even be some sort of policy that can be updated a little bit to make some of this a little more natural. So. In the communications, when communication fails, it's not just when radios fail. No. But what's some of the other issues that you've come across as far as people talking over each other or all trying to repeat the same thing? Well, one that comes to mind when you were talking about the Mayday type situation, one of the real world issues with gunshots at a scene is every police officer on the scene can hear the gunshots.
Yes.
But I don't need all 15 officers on the scene to tell me that they're hearing gunshots.
Right.
We all hear it.
Yeah. And I think that's a big thing on it. And that's every day, right? Is that you have somebody who comes up on the radio and says something and they're not listening to each other.
Right.
And so it's not, you'll have somebody say something and then 5 minutes later, the partner who's standing right next to them says the same thing on the radio. And that's that radio discipline. That is that being cognizant of what's going on in your area and listening to what is actually being said. which is going to be very, very hard on a critical
Right.
situation, right? Because you are going to get tunnel vision. It is going to happen. You're going to start, losing that audio, and it's going to be forcing yourself. It's back to training, though.
Right.
It's back to training. And every day when you're starting to hear those things and somebody does have a hard time in any small type of critical, incident of listening to their partner, it's stopping that as a leader and going to them and saying, hey, you're repeating something he just said, which means you're not listening to the radio, and that's going to be critical. So fixing those little things as you're seeing them come up, so that it's not game day, and then you're trying to fix that.
Absolutely.
Leaders need to lead.
Yes.
Right. So if you're a leader on one of those teams, hey, I'll be the one talking on the radio. Tell me what you want me to say, or
Yes.
I need to say, and I'll make sure it goes out over the radio. But again, it comes back to dispatchers, our communications professionals. I know when they started talking, somebody said it earlier, I started paying attention. Right. Whereas that auditory exclusion from all the chitter chatter that you're getting is not really relevant to you.
Right.
But the minute the dispatchers start talking, you kind of keen up. And so they can help police that, I think.
Absolutely. And I'm going to give another best practice I saw that was actually developed by one of our other instructors some years ago. She developed scripted training. And what I mean by that is let's say you're going through an exercise and you bring a team into a room. You may or may not be using actors or, potential moulage patients or anything. But what you can do is have something written down of that's what they need to transmit on the radio. And it does two things. One, it helps everyone else in the scenario hear information on the radio that they need to act on. But if you write it succinctly, you give them the practice of how to say something succinctly.
Yeah.
So doing, little scripted trainings, because the reality is we don't all have experience going to a critical incident, especially of an active shooter incident type, where your brain really is it's in a fog. It's trying to figure out, what do I need to say? I've got all this going on in front of me, and being able to kind of script through the kinds of things you need to say on these scenes, I think is really important. Not in a memorization sort of way, but just in a practice. You're kind of rehearsing.
Well, that's what we do even in training, right? In FTO, that's what we do. We give them for, be on the lookout. We hand them a thing and say, this is exactly what you're saying.
Right.
And so then they read it off. And, when they first start, it's kind of funny because you can hear them and they're reading off a piece of paper versus once they eventually get it and they can just, read off a bolo from memory instead of having that script in front of them. That is what we do. It's all about training.
Absolutely. So what are your final thoughts? What do you think, Bruce?
I think the biggest thing I can say is most of our communication failures could be cured if we come up with a plan before we need it. I read something somewhere that we gain experience a minute after we needed it, right? and I thought to myself at the time, that translates into what we do all the time, right? So we can take that out of the loop. If we plan for it, train to that standard, we can take some of that out. We're going to gain experiences from other people's experiences, and communications is a big one.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd have to mirror the same thing. Is that it's all about training. It's about training for that failure, and knowing what you're going to do game day is in preparing yourself. That game day, this goes wrong. What are we going to do? Even we talked about it earlier. Even using runners. If you're using runners, you have to prepare them. Then that. You're going to be going back and forth, ask for more resources than you normally would, right? Because you don't want to be going back and forth with that runner. So you're going to ask for more and considering those things early ahead of time through training, that's where you can get that experience.
Right. And thinking about things, communications can fail. I know back home, we had a plan that if the radio system went completely down, that we would use the phone to send out the calls to the various little substations that we had, and the officers would go complete that mission, use their simplex frequency to talk to each other for officer safety, and then come back and get the next mission, right? So it's not wild, far-fetched things, just things that could happen.
Technology fails.
Technology fails. Talk about it a little bit. But then I think, again, borrowing from the experience of others, listening to podcasts is a really good way to hear best practices and tips and tricks that have worked for other people, and borrowing from those experiences.
Sure.
We talk a lot about looking at after action reports, and never in a second guessing sort of way. That's not it at all. No. But unique things happen in other communities, and you need to ask yourself, if that happened to us, if we went into the fourth floor of a hospital and we had no communication, how would we get the job done, right?
Exactly.
And those are the questions that you answer now.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much again for coming in.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the studio, and it's been a lot of fun to talk about this issue. And again, I think there's a lot that can be done there. Thank you, as always, to Carla Torres, our producer, for keeping
all her hard work, keeping us on time.
Yes.
Keeping us well behaved at times.
Ouch.
Well, I didn't look at you for a reason. Maybe, I don't know. So, but again, if you haven't already, please subscribe, like our podcasts, share them with others. We have topics that range from how civilians can help in an active shooter type event to all of these topics, and they're always just great discussions. I mean, we have some people that have really had an opportunity to solve some of these issues. So if you haven't liked or subscribed, please do. And until next time, thank you very much.